Consequently, this spirit constructs for itself not merely a world, but a world that is double divided and self-opposed. The world of the ethical spirit is its own present world, and therefore each of its powers exists in this unity, and insofar as they are distinct from one another, they are in equilibrium with the whole. Nothing has the significance of being the negative of self-consciousness. Even the departed spirit is present in his blood relationship, in the self of the family, and the universal power of the government is the will, the self of the nation. Here, however, what is present has the significance only of an objective reality, the consciousness of which exists in a beyond. Each single moment, qua essence, receives this, and with it actuality from an other. And so far as it is actual, its essence is something other than its own actuality. Nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself and indwells it, but each has its being in something outside of and alien to it. The equilibrium of the whole is not the unity which remains with itself, nor the contentment that comes from having returned into itself, but rests on the alienation of opposites. The whole, therefore, like each single moment, is a self-alienated actuality. It falls apart into a realm in which self-consciousness as well as its object is actual, and into another, the realm of pure consciousness, which, lying beyond the first, is not a present actuality, but exists only for faith. Now, just as the ethical world, which is separated into divine and human law in their various forms, and its consciousness, which is separated into knowing and not knowing, returns from that dividedness into its destiny, into the self as the negative power of this antithesis, so these two realms of the self-alienated spirit will also return into the self. But if the former was the first, merely immediately valid self, the single person, this second realm which returns out of its externalization into itself, will be the universal self, the consciousness which has grasped its notion, and these spiritual worlds, all of whose moments insist on a fixed actuality and non-spiritual existence of their own, will dissolve in pure intellectual insight. This insight, as the self that apprehends itself, completes the stage of culture. It apprehends nothing but self, and everything is self. That is, it comprehends everything, wipes out the objectivity of things, and converts all intrinsic being into a being for itself. In its hostility to faith as the alien realm of essence lying in the beyond, it is the Enlightenment. This Enlightenment completes the alienation of spirit in this realm too, in which that spirit takes refuge and where it is conscious of an unruffled peace. It upsets the housekeeping of spirit in the household of faith by bringing into that household the tools and utensils of this world, a world which that spirit cannot deny is its own, because its consciousness likewise belongs to it. In this negative activity, pure insight at the same time realizes itself and produces its own object, the unknowable, absolute being, and the principle of utility. Since in this way actuality has lost all substantiality and nothing in it has intrinsic being, not only the realm of faith, but also the realm of the actual world is overthrown. The revolution gives birth to absolute freedom, and with this freedom the previously alienated spirit has completely returned into itself, has abandoned this region of culture, and passes on to another region, the region of the moral consciousness. There is a lot going on here in this long paragraph number 486, which is concluding the introductory 3 paragraphs to the section of culture, or alienated spirit. And I would say that the 2 main things that are occurring is Hegel is, in a very big picture kind of way, contrasting 2 different worlds. The world of an earlier stage of the ethical spirit, what we traced earlier in this spirit section. We're talking about the 2 different laws and all of that. And then the transition that we had, he's not going to talk very much about that in here, but the transition through legal right and the Lord of the world. And then what the world of culture is actually going to encompass. So what is going on in this long, long section of the phenomenology. And then the second thing that he's going to do is trace out for us in advance, again, very, very big picture, some of the key developments that are taking place within these sections of this portion of the work yet to come through the many paragraphs that we're going to be plowing through. So I think it's worthwhile focusing very closely on each part of this passage. So he says, this spirit constructs for itself not merely a world, but a world that is double, divided, and self-opposed. Now, he's immediately after that going to start talking about the world of ethical spirit. That is not the same world as what he just talked about. He's talking here about the world of culture. So the world of culture is a world that is double, divided, and self-opposed. There are oppositions within the world itself. There are oppositions within the alienated consciousnesses that are taking part in the formation and the ongoing process of that world. And then there's also, of course, the interaction between those consciousnesses and that world. So then he goes back and starts talking about the world of the ethical spirit. He says the world of the ethical spirit is its own present world. It has its world for it. It's got a kind of sureness and certainty about itself. Remember, where did we begin all of that discussion? You remember how we ended the reason section with these ethical masses, and finally the ethical becomes aware of itself, and it's totally certain of itself. It's got starting points. It doesn't need to prove laws anymore. It's got the laws given to it. There's a certain positivity. Well, we saw how that played itself out in this ethical world. So he says, each of the powers exists in this unity. What are the powers? Well, the divine law and the human law, as we saw, and the people who are embodying or representing or implementing them. So he says, insofar as they are distinct from one another, they're in equilibrium with the whole. Now, this is granted a bit of idealizing, isn't it? Because we just went through two big sections preceding the legal rights section, in which we saw that whatever equilibrium was there was kind of a equilibrium that could easily get out of whack, and that things were not quite so simple as a nice, stable equilibrium. We had the vision of that at a few points, but we also saw that no, that was not actually sustainable. That's how we got here in the first place, right? The equilibrium did not hold. But so what is Hegel talking about here? This is really sort of the self-representation of the ethical world making itself, how it grasps itself. So he says, nothing has the significance of being the negative of self-consciousness. That's an interesting thing to say. Another way of saying this is there is no alienation of self-consciousness. As a matter of fact, one of the problems with what was going on in the ethical world was, in fact, the opposite of alienation, sort of a complete identification and knowing with complete certainty exactly what you're doing and exactly who you represent, and so much so that the person who, like Antigone, identified herself with the divine law, could see in the human law just a lawlessness or arbitrariness and wouldn't give it its due, right? And likewise, you can say Crayon or, the two brothers representing the human law also see in the divine law something that is, really out of line, because they so much identify with their point of view. In the world of culture, that self-assurance, when it is there, rings kind of hollow. So over here, we don't have something as being the negative of self-consciousness, as Hegel says. What are the examples? He says, even the departed spirit is present in blood relationship. It's assimilated in a certain way. There's nothing that's pure negativity, right? The universal government is the will, the self of the nation. The blood relationship is the self of the family. Now Hegel switches, and he says, here, however, what is present has the significance only of an objective reality. An objective reality. Usually that we think of objective reality as being something really good. Oh, you've got objective reality. That's so much better than subjective reality. If it's objective, it must be true. Interestingly, from the Hegelian perspective, if it's merely objective, it's actually lacking in the most important mode of truth. It does not know itself. Objective reality is, in a certain way, lesser than the right kind of subjective reality, being, a subject. So he goes on and he says, the consciousness of this exists in a beyond. Each single moment, qua essence, receives this, and with it actuality, from an other. Insofar as it is actual, its essence is something other than its own actuality. Nothing that is actual, that is wirklich, really is what it is entirely. Its meaning and its fullness of essence lies in some sort of beyond. And Hegel is going to play this out in as we saw in the previous paragraph, this movement from actual consciousness to pure consciousness. The pure consciousness supplies it with a beyond. So he goes on and he says, now this is a really beautiful passage. Think about what this is like. Nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself and indwells it, but each has its being in something outside of it and alien to it. Think about the contrast between that and where consciousness was in, say, the Greek city-state, the way that Hegel is representing it, or even the early Roman Republic, the way that Hegel is representing it. Or we might pick all sorts of other examples where people, know where they fit and understand the contours of their world. This world of culture that we're moving into, everything has its meaning in something else, not in itself. It has no indwelling spirit that it can completely rely upon. And we might say, we're talking about the Middle Ages and all that. We have local communities where things are like this, like the Greek city-states. But something different has come on the scene, a universal religion that is really, it's kind of funny. There's a bit of a digression, but if we think about the so-called age of faith, or from the perspective of the Enlightenment, the Dark Ages, right? If we want to think about things as they really were historically, as we find them through historical documents, Western Europe never was fully Christianized in the sense that, the church ran everything. As a matter of fact, even within the church's institutions, there's all these movements and, rises and reforms and degenerations and corruptions and all these things going on at the same time. So things are not as simple as just, they just all believed in something. It was the age of faith. No, you could in fact be in some sort of organic community and see that as being what was most important. But it was also possible to exist in this sort of world of alienated spirit. So like he says, nothing has a spirit that's grounded within itself and indwells it. Each has its being in something outside and alien to it. The equilibrium of the whole is not the unity which remains with itself, nor the contentment that comes from having returned to itself, but rests on the alienation of opposites. There's a new kind of dynamism occurring here, a disequilibrium that allows for something new to come on the scene. So what is that? Hegel tells us the whole, therefore, like each single moment, is a self-alienated actuality. The whole of this world that is being experienced is a self-alienated actuality. What does that mean? That means that for the individual, there's no losing yourself. Let's say you forget who you are and where you fit and all that. There's no losing yourself in the world that used to be and overcoming alienation that way. No, because the whole world is alienated. Everybody within it is alienated. So where do you turn? All right, so here's where we go. He says it falls apart into a realm in which self-consciousness as well as its object is actual, and into another realm, the realm of pure consciousness, which lying beyond the first is not a present actuality. The realm of pure consciousness, and again, don't associate this yet with, like Kantian pure reason or any sort of transcendental thing like that. Pure consciousness, in this case, means something more like the divine, something like what we attribute to God or to other divine beings, however you want to think about it, right? But this is not actual. This is not something you can experience within the world. This is not something that you can enter into a kind of communication with. It has to be grasped in other ways. So he goes on and he says, this is not a present actuality, but exists only for, and here we get this key word, faith or belief, Glauben. Notice what he says. This exists for faith. Faith of who? The faith of the actual consciousness. The person who is, who exists, who lives, who breathes, who weeps over his alienation, who strives to overcome it. A comportment of that is faith, belief. But it's belief in something that ends up being its antithesis of pure consciousness. So he goes on and he says, just as the ethical world, which is separated into human and divine law in their various forms, and its consciousness, which is separated into knowing and not knowing, returns from that dividedness into its destiny, into the self as the negative part of this antithesis, so these two realms of the self-alienated spirit are also going to return into the self. But then he says, but if the former was the first merely immediately valid self, the single person, this second realm, something new here, right? The single person who we got in the transition, of course. The single person who returns out of externalization into itself will be the universal self, the consciousness which has grasped its notion, its begriff, right? And these spiritual worlds, all of whose moments insist on a fixed actuality and non-spiritual existence of their own, will dissolve in pure intellectual insight. And now we get a second movement, beyond faith. Hegel thinks that the historical process is going to, be this sort of working through faith for a long time and then working beyond it into something else, something that dissolves faith because it is better than faith. It allows for the individual to figure out where he or she actually does fit in and connects with the absolute. So Hegel goes on and he says, this insight as the self that apprehends itself, this overcoming of alienation, right, completes the stage of culture. Notice what he says here. It's very similar to what he said in the reason section, isn't it? It apprehends nothing but self and everything as self. It comprehends everything. It wipes out the objectivity of things, converts all intrinsic being into a being for itself. Doesn't that sound very similar to what Hegel was saying reason did at the beginning of the reason section? Reason is the totality of everything. Reason discovers itself everywhere. That is what insight is going to do. Hegel associates this with a particular historical set of movements, which in German are the Aufklärung, and in English we call the Enlightenment. French has its own thing, siècle de lumière. So he talks about here the conflict that takes place. A hostility to faith as the alien realm of essence lying in the beyond. This is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment completes the alienation of spirit in this realm too, in which that spirit takes refuge, in which it's conscious of an unruffled peace. Notice some of the interesting things he says. It upsets the housekeeping of spirit in the household of faith by bringing into that household the tools and utensils of this world, a world that spirit cannot deny is its own. So although spirit, in the form of people and institutions, wants to stick with the world of faith, the Enlightenment is occurring, and the Enlightenment is bringing in all sorts of cool stuff. And, the priests and the other people associated with that are like, hey, don't bring that crap in here. And the scientists and the writers and all these other thinkers associated with the Enlightenment, it's really quite exciting, isn't it, to think about this, are bringing these things in and saying, no, this is part of the furniture of the world as well. You can't keep this out. Hegel takes this as a decisive development. So he says, in this negative activity, pure insight at the same time realizes itself and produces its own object, the unknowable absolute being. And notice what he says after this. And the principle of utility. Utilitarianism, this is a little bit of a digression. Utilitarianism has a somewhat longer, or earlier pedigree, let's say, than we typically associate with it. We think of it as starting with Jeremy Bentham, but if you actually read through literature from the Enlightenment, you're going to see this word utility used all over the place. Hume uses it, for example. Voltaire uses it. All sorts of people are making appeals to utility. And when you make an appeal to utility, you're doing something that's very this-worldly, as opposed to the world of faith, right? There's no beyond. We're saying things need to be useful here. Now, for Hegel, this development leads into something, again, new. This is going to be the third section of this portion of the text. So he says, since in this way actuality has lost all substantiality and nothing in it has intrinsic being, not only in the realm of faith, but also in the realm of the actual world, the realm of the actual world is overthrown. So what happens? The revolution gives rise, he says, to absolute freedom, and with this freedom, the previously alienated spirit has returned to itself. It has gone full circle and has abandoned this region of culture and passes on to another region, the region of the moral consciousness. So that is preparing us for what's eventually going to be happening in the third section, which is very interesting, where we're going to get all sorts of cool stuff going on. But a little bit before that, we're going to have absolute freedom, and absolute freedom is going to lead us to the terror. So that is why it's the third section, beginning in 582. So that gives us sort of a roadmap of where we're going and an explanation of how we're going to get there and why we have to do that. We're still at the very beginning of this, so we're still dealing with a world of alienated spirit. We haven't made any of these movements yet, but now we know where we're going.